y'all, it's Heel Heat time.
Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and this is going to be a Heel Heat Top 10. The topic of this Top 10? Top 10 wrestlers that were better off in WCW. And basically, it's guys that wrestled both in the WWE/WWF and WCW, but were treated better in WCW. Jumping right into it, number 10, Dean Malenko. The Iceman, the man of 1,000 holds. There were so many superlatives about Dean Malenko. He was such a great wrestler, one of the premier cruiserweights, and one of the highlights of the cruiserweight division in WCW, which was something that really set them apart and made them different to WWF at the time. Here was a guy that could wrestle with absolutely anybody and put on a great match and a great show. He jumped ship with the Radicals, with Saturn, Benoit, and Guerrero, and it seems like he's a forgotten Radical almost. I mean, he had a couple little things he did in WWE, but he was never treated as importantly as he was in WCW, where he was a member of the Four Horsemen. He was a multiple-time cruiserweight champion, tag champion, a TV champion. I mean, he may not have broken through the mid-card, but he was a valuable guy to them in the way they treated him. WWE, the angle we remember most is when they tried to say he was a ladies' man and was kind of the old, like, if they would call me skinny or call a tall guy a short stack. They were trying to play against type. But to me, I thought he was lost in the shuffle. I think he's one of the great wrestling talents that there's probably ever been. And it really is a shame that WWE couldn't have found something better when he came there. Now, our number 9, the man called Sting. Now, this would probably be way higher on our list if this wasn't mostly, at least partially, Sting's fault. I believe if Sting would have came over in 2001, 2002, 2003, basically 10 years before he decided to finally come to WWF, or WWE would have merged to that, it might have been a different story. However, because he waited so long, unfortunately, we had an old man that was 10 years past his prime at the very least, and he was a shell of himself. I mean, this was the icon. This was the franchise of WCW. This was the flag bearer. This was the guy that main evented every main WCW pay-per-view, and unquestionably, or arguably, some of their biggest matches, whether it be him versus Flair at Great American Bash when he won the championship, his feud with Vader, his feud with Hogan in the NWO leading up to Starrcade, his matches with Luger. I mean, all the way up and down the card. This was a guy that was the franchise, and he probably would have been the number 1 guy on this list if he didn't wait so long to come to WWF. Or, I keep saying WWF, WWE when he finally did arrive. So, I can't fault WWE in this. However, even when they brought them there, he wasn't used as properly as he should, so he does deserve to make the list. Now, our number 8. This one is much like our number 10, Dean Malenko, and he's one of the flag bearers for the Cruiserweight division. And that is the Ultimo Dragon. I don't understand how a guy who's an absolute legend in Japan, Mexico, and WCW comes to WWF. And yes, we see you, Ultimo. I see all the belts. Enough bragging. We know who you are. It's cool. He's famously had 9 belts, 9 championships from all over the world at the same time. Even one that was considered a WWF Light Heavyweight Championship, although it hadn't been recognized in some time on WWF television. he was their champion for that division on WCW television. And much like I said with Malenko, he was kind of the guy, one of the highlights between him, Malenko, and Rey Mysterio, probably the three real breakout wrestlers and stars of the Cruiserweight division, the three guys that it was built upon. I mean, you could add guys like Jericho and Psychosis and, much of the other great talent that was in and out of that division. But to me, when it was announced he signed with the WWE, I was super excited because I wanted to see what he could do with some other different talent. And unfortunately, I barely remember his run in the WWE. His best memory is tripping on the stage at WrestleMania, so I don't know what to say about this one. It's a failed opportunity at the very least, and someone who deserved a much better treatment, to be treated like the legend he was. Now, our number 7, Ron Simmons, a.k.a. Farooq. Now, I know what you're saying. He's a WWE Hall of Famer, and he had major success with his Nation of Domination run and the Acolytes. However, with all the success he had in WWE, he probably would have made the Hall of Fame just on that. But when you look at what he was in WCW with his team with Butch Reed and Doom, and being the first African-American WCW champion, you took a guy who was a groundbreaking star and a superb talent, and you brought him in and put a Nerf helmet on him. And then, it's to his credit that he made it through that horrible first iteration of the gimmick and brought out the Nation version of himself, and then ultimately him and JBL made a fantastic tag team. But it's hard to look at a guy who's a trailblazing pioneer in one company and a tag team legend in another company. As great as he was in WWE, he was even greater in WCW. So, for that reason alone, he makes the list. Now, our number 6 is a guy who actually had a few different stints in both companies, and that's Raven. Whether it be Scotty Flamingo, Johnny Polo, or the character that he's most known as, Raven, he bounced back and forth as Scotty Flamingo, Scotty the Body, first in WCW, had marginal success, went to the WWE as Johnny Polo, became a manager, most notably managing the Quebecers. Went from that, decided he's not done wrestling, he wants to be a wrestler, reinvented himself in ECW, and every company took notice. Goes to WCW, and while he never reached some of the heights as a lot of the other people on this list, he was a very serious mid-card to upper high-card talent. He was a guy that you could put in the main event and no one would laugh at it. He was a guy that could be wrestling for the TV title, US title, tag title, even the world title at times. And his whole presentation in WCW just fit, and it kept the ECW character of Raven, which is where he was at his best, but that's another list for a different story. To me, Raven in WCW, as much as a missed opportunity as he was when he went back to the WWE as Raven, and he was relegated to being the record-setting hardcore champion, kind of felt like a drop. It kind of felt like they didn't understand the Raven character. And the funny thing is, he's the most decorated WWE superstar of all time. You can look it up. Just based on the fact of all of the hardcore championships he had. That gave him more championship wins than any other WWF competitor, which sounds insane. But He had a mostly forgettable WWF run. Anytime he had any semblance of a storyline or something that seemed like it would go somewhere, it was squashed right away. At least in WCW, we had his feuds with Benoit, with the feud with with the Flock itself, with Saturn, with DDP through the years, and on and on. We've seen him build to have be a serious contender and a serious wrestler. Going from that, our number 5. It's a guy that they wanted to push to the moon in WWE. He came off a run in WCW and the NWA initially. We're talking about the total package, Lex Luger. He's brought in the WWF firstly as a narcissist and then morphed into basically the All-American new version of Hulk Hogan, which is what a lot of people looked at him as. Unfortunately, even main eventing WrestleMania 10, he never quite reached the heights he would in WCW. In WCW, he became a multiple-time world champion, a world tag team champion, U.S. champion, a guy that was draped with belts all through his run. He didn't win any belts in the WWE. I mean, this guy, he's a person that a lot of people give flack looking back at it now because he wasn't the greatest wrestler. But I guarantee you, if you get an unaltered copy, and I don't know because I haven't watched it on the network, if it's been altered at all, but if you were there or you remember when Luger beat Hogan on Monday Nitro for the WCW Championship, that was probably one of the loudest pops in WCW history. And to me, I know it was a missed opportunity. I know they didn't much. He lost about 6 days later, but he was a big star that he was supposed to be in WCW and never quite made it to in the WWE. Speaking of big stars, number 4. One of the guys that was a huge star all through the NWA era, all the way to the end of WCW, was Diamond Dallas Page. A self-made man who famously joined wrestling late, became a manager first, and then went from a low-card guy to a mid-card guy and kept building himself up. He got the rub of being the first guy to turn down the NWO, became a multiple-time WCW champion, became a highlight of the show, amassed a huge fan base, and then the bottom fell out. WCW shuts down, DDP decides to go to WWE, gets turned into the Undertaker stalker. And then from there he morphed into a motivational speaker gimmick, which is kind of what he does in real life now with his DDP yoga. But we're talking about a guy who is multiple-time world champion, and he was basically an afterthought. And I know he was later on in his career, and yes, we were in the middle of an age where you had guys like Stone Cold, Kurt Angle, The Rock, all were there still, Mick Foley for a little while, The Undertaker, you had emerging guys like Kane and Edge, and all this took a role into it. But to me, he should have been a guy that came into WWE and was considered a threat for any championship that he wanted to be a threat for. Alas, it didn't happen that way, hence why he makes this list. Now, our number 3. I debated putting this guy on this list at all because of his latest run with the WWE, and that's Goldberg. His latest kind of nostalgia run where he was given the Universal Championship, to me, that was a little bit too little too late. His initial WWE run was something that was met with a lot of fanfare. We had the guy coming over who, much like Sting, was one of the faces of WCW, multiple-time champion, and arguably their biggest homemade star. Comes into the WWE, and we have all the dream matches he could potentially have. Brock Lesnar, Triple H, Undertaker, all the way up and down. The Rock, Kurt Angle. And, I mean, there's tons of dream matches that could have happened. He could have had amazing matches and an amazing run. However, once again, he was treated as he wasn't as badly treated as Diamond Dallas Page, but he wasn't treated as Goldberg either. This wasn't your Goldberg from WCW. This was a Goldberg that would lose. And probably, if you look back on it, he probably lost more WWE matches than he ever did in WCW. In 3 or 4 years at WCW, he lost less matches than he did in, I think, 1.5 years, 2 years that he was in WWE. So, to me, here was a guy that you could have pushed in, and he could have immediately been the dream matches guy. You could have had him wrestle every dream match you could imagine. Goldberg and Undertaker, Goldberg and Angle. Like I said, I ran through the list already. To me, he didn't ever seem happy. It seemed like he was only there to put over Triple H, in my opinion. So, to me, it hurt a bit of his nostalgia. And I'm not a Goldberg fan. I just know the fact that he was a huge star, and he could have been a huge star in both companies. Now, speaking of huge stars, our number 2. One of the most highly regarded wrestlers in the history of the business. Perennial babyface. A lot of people call him the best babyface in wrestling. That's Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. And I know what you're going to say. You're going to go back and you're going to go to Steamboat and Savage from WrestleMania 3. And yes, while this was a great match and probably the highlight of his career, do keep in mind that just a few short years later, they put him in a dragon Halloween costume spitting fire. So, as good as that was, and his Intercontinental run really wasn't that great, to be honest with you. And a lot of it did was he wanted to take time off for personal reasons. Kind of got punished a bit for that, I guess is the best way to say it. So, he goes into WCW, puts on 3 of the greatest matches of all time with Ric Flair, becomes a multiple-time world champion there, goes on to have successful tag team reigns with the likes of Shane Douglas and Dustin Rhodes, and just a guy who was treated like he was the big star that he actually was. In WWE, he hit the glass ceiling. In WCW, he broke through and became the glass ceiling. So, to me, as great as his run was in WWE, he was even greater in WCW. And he was a guy that really, really is what it epitomizes to be a legend. Now, before we get into our number 1, if you haven't seen my top 10s before, we do a little thing here called the best of the rest. It's basically the people that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it for any particular reason. Jumping right into that, first up we have a tag team, the Public Enemy. Now this one's probably near and dear to my heart, and no, wrong Public Enemy. Gotta take that picture down. Although that is an amazing group, you should probably look up their music if you like rap music. One of the most historical bands in all of rap history. That Public Enemy. And much like I said with Raven, their ECW run is even better than their WCW run. However, the fact that they were a WCW Tag Team Champion came into WWE and basically came in and were forced out in less than a month tells me that they weren't exactly used to their best capabilities there. Another guy, also on our best of the rest, who had a similar path, is Buff Bagwell. He was a guy that in the last couple of years of WCW really set himself up as a future star, and a guy that was building, and a guy whose fan base kept on growing and his talent kept on growing. Unfortunately, like the Public Enemy, he had problems when he came to the WWE. He took himself a little bit too seriously. There are some famous stories about his mother calling in for him, so he unfortunately had one and done. He was one match on WWE, and that was it. Last but not least on our best of the rest, much like I said with Public Enemy, much like I said with Raven, it was a guy that was even better in ECW than either of the two companies. We're talking about the franchise Shane Douglas. Now, he bounced a bit between WCW, WWE, and ECW. He had early stints in WWE, stints in WCW as a Dynamic Dudes, stints with Steamboat. But the thing was, his height of his WWE run was he was handed an Intercontinental belt as Dean Douglas and then lost it 12 minutes later. So, while he was an Intercontinental Champion, he was one that was basically used to get the belt from Shawn Michaels to Razor Ramon without Shawn Michaels having to do the job. Fast forward, he comes back to WCW. He's a U.S. champion. He's a tag champion. He's a guy that's taken a little bit more seriously. So, while neither run was as great as his ECW run, it felt like the Shane Douglas of WCW was treated as more of a serious competitor there than he ever would have been in WWE. Now, before we get into our number one, if you think I left something off the list completely, if you think I put someone up too high, someone down too low, let me know what you think. Hit me down here in the comments, even if you agree with me. Say, hey, that's a great list, I agree. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your opinion on who was better in WCW than they were in WWE. And also make sure to like and share. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ding the bell so you get notifications every time a video drops. All that being said, our number one guy who was better off in WCW than WWE, Big Van Vader. Vader in WCW was a monster. There's no two ways around it. Between WCW and Japan, this guy was basically everything you could want in a big man wrestler. He was a big man that looked believable, looked credible, and could go with anybody on the roster, whether it be legendary fights against Stan Hansen in Japan, or wrestling guys like Flair and Cactus Jack and Sting in WCW and Ron Simmons. He's a guy that really set the bar and really showed what a big man wrestler could actually be in a time when we were seeing guys that, and this is no knock on him, it was a style. We were seeing guys like Earthquake and Typhoon that weren't as mobile, and I love both those guys, by the way, so please don't take it as a knock. This was the guy that kind of, he could move as well as Shawn Michaels, and he could brawl as well as anybody in the roster. He was, when you would think about a guy that probably should have been a perfect fit for Vince McMahon and what he did in the WWE, it was Vader. And the hype and what we thought as fans we were going to get was never achieved in WWE. He was never looked at as anything serious. He did have a couple chances at the title, but no one ever considered that he would actually win. The highlight, honestly, of his WWF run was his appearances on Boy Meets World. I mean, here's a guy that's an unstoppable monster in WCW. I mean, absolute unstoppable monster. In WWF, he cuts a promo and calls himself a big fat piece of shit. I don't know what better way to explain this list than that dichotomy right there. With all that being said, absolute legend Vader, a guy that we lost way too young just a few few months ago, actually. And just a wasted opportunity, in my opinion. With all that being said, like I said before, please let me know what you think. If you agree with my list, if you think I put someone high, someone too low, left someone off altogether, hit me down here in the comments. Like, share, all that good stuff. Hit the bell for notifications. Subscribe if you haven't already. But my name is George Coles, and this has been another Heel Heat Top 10.